You're listening to a series on the historicity of Jesus' resurrection. Most of the information in this series is drawn from Dr. Dale Allison's The Resurrection of Jesus, Apologetics, Polemics, History. You can find links to other episodes in this series, as well as his fantastic book, in the description. Stop me if you've heard this one before. The idea of a dying and rising prophet was so well known in Jesus' time that the disciples easily could have used this pre-existing story to make something up about Jesus dying and rising. In this episode, we will closely examine this theory, aided of course by Dr. Allison's fantastic chapter on the notion. Here's the evidence for this claim. Jews believed in a time of tribulation before God's final triumph. The Jewish prophets often suffered, and John the Baptist was martyred for his beliefs. The point is this: Jesus didn't have to be Einstein to figure out he was on the path to being killed. And it's not just the Jesus of the Gospels who predicts his own death. Paul affirms that Jesus knew he would die. So we know that Mark didn't pull this out of thin air. What about Jesus' predictions for a resurrection? Well, maybe he was just trying to instill some optimism that his movement would succeed. Furthermore, scholars from the older historical Jesus quests frequently argued that Jesus never claimed to be a king or the Son of God. That was just something his followers made up about him. Let's begin deconstructing these claims. First of all, Old Testament prophecies like Psalm 110 were famously applied to Jesus quite early. Psalm 110 reads, "The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool." I cannot stress enough how radical it would have been for early Christians to elevate Jesus to that level of godhood. While other religions had the ideas of demigods, Judaism was very strictly monotheistic by this time. This gives rise to the question: if the disciples believed Jesus to be their Messiah, especially at the level of God, how did they think Jesus would save them? And what happened to change their expectations? So we've established that Jesus anticipated his death and resurrection. A dying prophet was quite common in Judaism. What about a resurrection? Well, most if not all mentions of the resurrection say it will happen at the end of time and it will happen to everyone at once. Essentially, Dr. Allison argues, as do most historical Jesus scholars, that even Jesus himself misunderstood his Father's plan. This would make sense given his statement in Mark that not even the Son will know when the resurrection will happen. And if you want to know how I personally reconcile Jesus' lack of knowledge with his perfectness, you can watch a vlog I made while I was in the Holy Land. Essentially, imperfect knowledge does not make someone an imperfect person. Moving on, what about the Messiah who will save Israel? The Old Testament mentions nothing about them rising from the dead. These two ideas, a general resurrection and a Messiah who will restore Israel, are totally distinct. And what will happen once the Messiah comes? The Messiah will be a new David, a militant leader who will restore temporal authority to Jerusalem and usher in a great age of prosperity. Basically, Jews from Jesus' time believed that a Messiah would come to liberate Israel, build a permanent temple, and bring about a great age for all. At the end of this age, all the dead would be resurrected. But instead of this happening, we get a Messiah who resurrects by himself, who does not build a new temple or lead a military reconquest of Israel, and leads his disciples to believe that there will be another resurrection. So let's take a step back. We've talked about how Jews before Jesus would have predicted their eschatological future, and we've talked about how Christians after Jesus saw their future. But what about that in-between time? If you were a disciple and saw your Messiah get crucified, what would you think and how would you react? Well, some people would just give up and go back to their regular lives, and we saw this in how Peter went back to being a fisherman. And this frequently happened to disciples of failed messiahs in first century Judaism. We've also established how Jesus considered himself the Messiah, a term which carried a lot of militant connotations back in the day. Upon his crucifixion, Jesus would have been considered a failure. What exactly would make a failed prophet's disciples stick around, though? Maybe an empty tomb, combined with some visions of his resurrection. In previous episodes, we've discussed how we could say with a pretty high degree of certainty that the tomb was indeed empty, and that the disciples did have visions. But regarding the latter, do visions of a resurrected Jesus mean he was actually resurrected? That will be the topic of next episode, but for now, let's put this ongoing puzzle together once more. Jesus believed himself to be the Messiah on a level similar to God. This was a radical idea that would have carried militant and political connotations. Now, Jesus also knew he was going to be killed and believed that the resurrection was near. And by resurrection, I mean the resurrection of everyone, not just himself. They used an incident at the temple as an excuse to arrest him and have him crucified, which was a common way of putting down insurrectionists in ancient Rome. After his crucifixion, a member of the Jewish upper class named Joseph of Arimathea dared to ask Pontius Pilate for the dead body. This request was approved, and Jesus was buried in a tomb. Within a week of the burial, Mary Magdalene saw an empty tomb and reported it to her friends, who must have found it strange. Nevertheless, as happened to followers of many failed revolutionaries, Jesus' disciples, including Peter, returned to their homes to go back to their day jobs. Soon after the empty tomb, Mary Magdalene saw a vision of Jesus. Around that time, Peter too saw a vision of Jesus, most likely while he was fishing on the Sea of Galilee. Something about these visions must have convinced the disciples that 1. Jesus and Jesus alone had resurrected from the dead, and 2. Jesus was not only the Messiah, but on a level similar to God. These radical, and I mean radical, beliefs inspired them to not only continue the movement Jesus started, but often to die for it as well. Now, does all this prove that Jesus resurrected from the dead? The answer is still no. There are other explanations worth exploring, which we will do in the next couple episodes. Until then, God bless you.